Are Protestants Christians? This is a question that was asked recently by one Timothy Gordon, a fairly popular Catholic YouTuber. His video was sent to me by somebody, and I was intrigued by the title, so I gave it a listen. It's about an hour long. And in this hour, Timothy Gordon says that he will inquire in technical theological terms whether or not Protestants are properly called Christians. He says that he has been thinking about this question quite a bit lately, so I was interested to see what conclusion he would reach and what support or arguments he had for that conclusion.
I'd say in all the important practical ways for any Protestant over 8 years old, they are not Christian. That's why we have to convert them.
The three arguments that he gives clearly point to that conclusion. He does call the argument strong and even says that one of them seems to be a slam dunk. Now, one of the interesting things about Gordon's project is that the Church has already answered the question. In the Church's decree on ecumenism, known as Unitatis Redintegratio, they say that men who believe in Christ and have been truly baptized are in communion with the Catholic Church, even though this communion is imperfect. All who have been justified by faith in baptism are members of Christ's body and have a right to be called Christian. Now, the document uses the word Christian over 40 times, and the document itself is actually referencing non-Catholic Christians. So it's interesting that Timothy Gordon thought that it was worth asking the question in the first place. We need to be very careful when the Church says something explicitly, and then we just act as though they haven't. So I am going to be pointing out some of the problems that I saw with Gordon's presentation. Of course, he had an hour to lay out his assertions, and it always takes more work to answer an assertion than to make one, so I'm not trying to make the definitive answer here, but simply to point out some of the flaws that I saw in the argumentation he gave. Now, some of these may seem a little nitpicky, but there's a reason I am pointing them out. You see, theology is one of the most difficult and nuanced subjects of study, and Gordon is going into a subset of theology that is even more nuanced and more difficult, namely Christology. That's just for one of the three arguments. He's also going to get into a pretty nuanced, detailed discussion of the sacraments.
A special episode of Rules for Retrogrades, an interrogation episode, whereby I will inquire in technical theological terms why or in what ways Protestants are and are not valid, qualifying Christians. It's a big question.
So given that Gordon has been thinking about these things for quite some time, that he had an hour to make his case, and that he is well aware that he is making very detailed theological statements, any error becomes cause for suspicion. So for example, somewhere toward the end of the video, Gordon lists Seventh-day Adventists, along with Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, as those who deny that Christ is part of the Trinity.
They separate Christ's ontological unity. They do this implicitly. They don't do it expressly the way Seventh-day Adventists, Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses expressly say Jesus is not part of the Trinity. Protestants say we love the Trinity, but we're with Nestorius.
Well, that is simply not true. Seventh-day Adventists are Trinitarian. He also accuses Protestants of only having one valid sacrament, namely baptism.
They're not practicing the faith because they're not ordering any of the sacraments toward the Eucharist. Even the one sacrament they have, baptism, they're not ordering it toward the Eucharist.
He states this several times and really stakes a lot of his case on that fact. But of course, Protestants don't just have one sacrament. Even on the Catholic view, Protestant marriage is not only valid but sacramental. If two baptized Protestants marry each other, they actually have a valid sacramental marriage, one that many Catholics who got married outside the church do not have. So it may just be that Gordon is being sloppy with these kinds of mistakes, but when you hear the arguments that he gives for why Protestants don't seem to be Christian, he is making very detailed, nuanced arguments. And the lack of slack that he gives Protestants, given the views that he is asserting on them, I feel like he should have done a better job. But to get back to the question at hand, are Protestants Christians? Again, the Church has already answered that question. It says very clearly, yes, they are. So if Gordon is going to call the church into question, he had better bring his A game. All right, so let's look at the three arguments that Timothy Gordon gives for the assertion that Protestants are not Christians.
And I believe I've given the three big reasons why. All the sacraments subserve the Eucharist. You can't separate Christ's ontological divine and personal unity, divine and human unity. And Christ has a real presence in the Eucharist, of course, which the Protestants always say, no, he doesn't. He's not here on earth with us. 1 and 3 insinuate in strong sacramental terms, this is not the sound of a Christian. And then 2, I think, kind of clinches it. What do you think? I'm very interested in your comments on this one. I don't know how this video is going to go over, but I've been thinking about this video for a long time. There you have it.
Protestants only have baptism as a valid sacrament. Now, this argument gets a little confusing because he seems to take it in two different directions. So besides the fact that the initial premise is false, because Protestants actually have more than one valid sacrament, he argues, on the one hand, that Protestants don't have recourse to reconciliation, the sacrament of confession. And so, after the age of reason, say 7 years old, if a Protestant commits mortal sin, they can't get out of it. Nothing can be done for them because they don't have confession, a sacramental reconciliation with God that can free them from that mortal sin.
So a baby that dies, heaven forfend, at age 2 or 4 or 6 will be good because they haven't attained the age of reason yet. It's impossible for them to mortally sin. They removed the worst damaging aspects of original sin, but once they start incurring real, actual, personal, mortal sin at 7 or 8, they have nothing to expunge that personal mortal sin. Whatever do they do?
Now again, I won't harp on the fact that Protestants actually have more than one sacrament that is valid. Gordon's Part A argument is that they don't have confession, and that's a serious problem because they can go into mortal sin and then there's nothing they can do about it. Well, there are several problems with this particular branch of this argument. First of all, technically Protestants do have recourse to confession. If you look at Canon 844 in our canon law, Protestants can receive the sacrament of reconciliation from a Catholic priest under certain circumstances. So it is not all or nothing, and it's not the case that there is nothing a Protestant can do. Moreover, being in mortal sin doesn't make you a non-Christian, which is the point of the video. Catholics commit mortal sin, and when they do not cease to be Catholic. If they did, then they wouldn't be able to go to the sacrament of reconciliation either, following Gordon's logic. So if committing a mortal sin doesn't make a Catholic non-Catholic, then committing a mortal sin doesn't make a Protestant a non-Christian. Further, I am not sure why having 7 sacraments is the definition of a Christian. The idea that you can define a Christian by their ability to receive the 7 sacraments, that's something that needs to be supported and argued for, and I don't believe Gordon did that. Again, I need to remind you that the Church has already spoken on this issue. There's only one sacrament you need to be a Christian, and that is baptism, something that Gordon admits is valid in Protestantism. So if he is going to go against what the Church says and argue that you need all 7 sacraments and they all have to be ordered toward the Eucharist in order to make someone a Christian, he's going to have to make a very solid case for that and not just define himself into being correct. I want to look at the argument that because Protestants deny Mary the title of Theotokos, or Mother of God, that they thereby are denying something important and orthodox about Jesus Christ himself, thus removing themselves from the category of people who have the right to be called Christians.
Assessing 3 factors, and 1 and 3 are pretty strong, but maybe not by themselves. They don't push the boulder over the cliff. I think 2 is a slam dunk. Nestorius came to the same erroneous conclusion that I'm condemning, rather, not that I did. He preached against Theotokos, and that's how it works. Ask your Protestant friends who are playing the role of Nestorius. Mary's the mother of human Jesus, but not divine Jesus, right? And they'll say, yeah, bro. Yeah, how is Mary, human Mary, going to be the mother of God? She must be the mother of God, because if she's not the mother of God, then we split Christ's nature. There is no ontological divine and human unity in the person of human Jesus. There's no hypostatic union, that means. There's no possibility, by simple math, of a Trinity, that means. All of Christianity falls apart.
The first thing I want to say is that I'm not sure it is the case that Protestants deny Mary the title Mother of God. Luther didn't have a problem with it, but even if they did, there is nothing about Protestantism per se that would make anybody deny Mary that title. Now, I will admit that the average Protestant on the street is probably going to reject that title when they first hear it, because it sounds a little weird. It's not something most Protestants have spent much, if any, time thinking about. And let's admit it, at first blush, it sounds rather crazy. Obviously, Mary didn't give birth to God. She gave birth to a human being, right? Well, before we answer that, we need to look back at the controversy itself, a controversy that actually required an ecumenical council to settle. The basic problem was there was this guy named Nestorius, and he taught that there was the Jesus who had a human nature and another Jesus that had the divine nature, and because he split up Jesus in that way, it created two persons instead of only one. That was a heresy, and that was what they got together to talk about. Now, in Orthodox Christianity, Jesus Christ is one person with two natures. That means that Jesus the person is human, and Jesus the person is divine. But there's only one person, and in fact that is a divine person. So no human person was created at the incarnation. If this is already sounding weird to you, don't worry. These are some of those fine points of theology I was talking about earlier. The reason Mary's title Mother of God is important is not because of what it says about Mary so much as what it says about Jesus. You see, if Mary gave birth to a person called Jesus Christ, then she gave birth to a human being and to a God, because the person of Jesus is both. Now, for people that haven't studied a lot of the metaphysics and theology behind this, it may make sense to say that, well, no, Jesus existed as God, the Word, before he incarnated. The incarnation was just the creation of Jesus' human nature. So Mary is only the mother of the human, not the mother of God. The problem with that, as people will note, is that mothers don't give birth to natures, they give birth to persons. Well, first of all, that response kind of smacks of being kind of a bumper sticker slogan. What is born, if it is a human, is a person with a human nature. The person and the nature go together. So while it is true that mothers don't just give birth to natures, they also don't just give birth to persons. So the idea that Mary could give birth to a person with two natures makes sense, but I think it's only fair to say that it's not obvious the first time you hear it. What we are talking about here is the communicatio idiomatum, the communication of idioms. We read in the Catholic Encyclopedia that in ordinary language, all the properties of a subject are predicated of its person. Consequently, the properties of Christ's two natures must be predicated of his one person. Now, once you understand that, it becomes a little more obvious why Mary not only is the Mother of God, but also why it's important to affirm that she is the Mother of God in that particular sense. To deny it logically entails a heresy, the heresy that Jesus is two persons. However, that is several steps down the road, and when you have a conclusion that is several logical steps away from the initial assertion that is made, you need to exercise a little bit of charity and find out if the person has connected all of those dots or not before accusing them of heresy. Now, if you think the communication of idioms is obvious, let me read some more from the Catholic Encyclopedia. The communicatio idiomatum can be used as long as both the subject and the predicate of a sentence stand for the person of Jesus Christ or present a common subject of predication. In general, concrete terms stand for the person if both their subjects and predicates be concrete terms. Concrete human names of Christ describe his person according to his human nature. Concrete terms used reduplicatively emphasize the nature rather than the person. Certain expressions, though correct in themselves, are for extrinsic reasons inadmissible. Abstract terms generally stand for their respective nature. Abstract names and attributes of God, though standing formally for the divine nature, imply really also the divine persons. We may replace a concrete divine name by its corresponding abstract one, but such expressions are liable to be misunderstood. There is no communicatio idiomatum between the two natures of Christ or between the Word and the human nature as such or its parts. In statements which interchange the divine and human properties of Christ, care must be taken in negative sentences, in exclusive sentences, and in There. Now, I'm sure that all of my Catholic listeners understood everything that I just said and could easily apply those rules to every sentence one can imagine regarding Jesus Christ, right? Okay, so in case my point wasn't obvious, we are dealing with very, very, very intricate theological principles that most people, Catholic or Protestant, have never even bothered to look into. And those very, very particular theological rules are regarding one of the hardest subsets of theology, namely Christology, theology itself being the queen of the sciences and one of the most difficult subjects one can learn about. So again, to take someone's knee-jerk reaction, to take their first couple of thoughts about something that they have maybe never been taught before, and run with it logically, apply all of these Catholic nuanced, deep philosophical principles to their statement, and then look at what comes out the other end and say, see, you're not a Christian because that's a heretical view. I say that's simply unfair. Now, what Protestants can be accused of, rightly, is not knowing church history. Even if someone doesn't understand a lot of nuanced philosophical theology, Christology, the Communicatio Idiomatum, etc., can simply learn what the church teaches. And the fact that many Protestants don't even know what the what is, much less the why that led to it, is a defect in their education. It's a defect in their understanding. But I wouldn't say that it's a defect in their faith if they don't know and understand what they're saying and then willfully choose to reject it. Since this debate was settled by an ecumenical council hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, it is a little annoying when Protestants act like it is a brand new question that needs to be thought out. Kind of like how Gordon is trying to think out the question of whether or not Protestants are Christians after it was already settled at an ecumenical council. So for that reason, I don't find this argument convincing either. Gordon says that because Protestants deny that Christ's substance is in the Eucharist after transubstantiation, that they are denying Christ, denying his reality in this world, and that makes them non-Christian. But where he ends up taking that argument has more to do with the fact that in Catholic theology, the sacraments are ordered toward the Eucharist, and thus even the sacraments Protestants have are sort of disordered because they aren't pointing toward the Eucharist, which they don't believe in because they deny transubstantiation, and so all of that leads to the conclusion that they are not Christians.
The third argument is simple. It's if you don't have the completeness of the sacraments, then you're not really a Christian. That's what I'm suggesting about the sacraments. You're not really a Christian unless you have all 7 sacraments. The post-conciliar church has shifted into this ecumenical moment where they talk about, well, Protestants have 1/7 of the sacraments. Not the most important one, not the bread of life, which Jesus says directly, you can't have life in you unless you consume the bread of life, which is me. I would suggest that to qualify as a Christian, because even baptism is ontologically ordered to Eucharist, you can't have part of the sacraments. They have a disordered version of baptism, even as the one of 7 sacraments they have.
Now, concerning the Protestant denial of the Eucharist, it is true that Protestants deny transubstantiation, the idea that bread and wine actually have a change of substance from bread and wine into the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ, retaining the accidents of bread and wine, but changing the substance, thereby changing the Eucharist or communion into a literal eating of Christ's flesh and blood, as stated in John chapter 6. The first thing I want to point out is that we have a bit of an equivocation here. To say that someone denies something about Christ is not necessarily to say that they deny Christ. For example, Peter denied Christ. Is this what Protestants are doing? Now, Gordon actually brings this up when he's talking about the Protestant denial of Mary's title, Mother of God. But I think it fits here too. There's a difference between denying that you know Christ, or denying what you know about Christ, and simply making a mistake about Christ. For example, if somebody told me that Jesus Christ was standing in the office next door to me right now, I would probably say, I don't believe that. But what if he actually was? What if Jesus manifested in the office next to mine? Well, I would be wrong about something about Jesus Christ. I would be denying something that is true of him, but I wouldn't be denying Christ. So we want to watch our language here. Typically, when we talk about denying Christ, we are talking about a knowledgeable, willful act of rejection. And that is not what Protestants are doing when it comes to the Eucharist. They simply disagree with how the Catholic Church has laid out the metaphysics. By the way, the Eastern Orthodox, who Gordon routinely held up as examples of actual Christians because they have the sacraments in this video, also deny transubstantiation. Now, they're in a different category than Protestants, but the point is, if we really want to get down to the nitty-gritty metaphysical level, Catholics are the only people who believe in transubstantiation. Our Catholic view of the Eucharist is something that is a very fine point. It's something that most Catholics can't even explain. And there are many statements with which many Catholics would disagree that are true from the Church's point of view, or that they would affirm that are false. So we need to be very careful about assigning a great deal of import to something like this. So, to summarize, I do not think Gordon has made the case that the Protestant denial of the Eucharist can be equated to a denial of Christ in such a way that they would be removed from the category of people who deserve to be called Christians. Well, that is all three of Gordon's arguments. I know that a lot more can be said about any of these. I'm really just kind of pointing out some of my knee-jerk responses to what was in his video. And I'm going to finish near where I started by speaking directly to my Protestant separated brethren out there. This question that Timothy Gordon asked in this video has already been answered by the Catholic Church. And the answer is yes. A person justified by faith in baptism is a Christian and is even imperfectly in communion with the Catholic Church. Now, does that mean they're on their way to heaven? No. The Protestant could be in mortal sin and may have a very hard time dealing with that. The person baptized and justified by faith might later reject their faith. Calling someone a Christian in the Catholic sense is referring to the indelible mark of the sacrament of baptism. It is not, as it is in many Protestant circles, an affirmation of salvation. Yes, baptism saves, just as it says in 1 Peter 3:21, but baptism is a one-time event. It doesn't keep somebody saved. That is where ongoing faith and the practice of Christian morality and the reception of the sacraments all comes into play. But the answer to Timothy Gordon's question, are Protestants Christian, has already been answered. All right, I hope this video has been informative to you. If it was, would you mind giving it a like? Subscribe if you're into Christian theology, apologetics, and philosophy. Till next time, I'm Doug. God bless.